Johannesburg.
Meanwhile, Cabinet has expressed its condolences to all families and friends of the women who were gruesomely murdered recently. In a statement released today, it paid respects to the families of Nosicelo Mtebeni, Palesa Maruping, Pheliswa, Dolly, Sawutana and many other women who may not have been reported by the media. Cabinet says these crimes have reminded all of us that gender-based violence and femicide remains the biggest challenge facing the country. To speak to what should be done to strengthen the protection of women, we're joined now by Bafana Khumalo, Sonke Gender Justice Co-executive Director, Lindi, Dlamini, the CEO of GBVF Response Fund, as well as Busisiwe, Deyi, Commissioner at Commission for Gender Equality. A very good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I want to follow up on that report that you've just heard from my colleague Hasina Gori, especially around the issue of the law and police in the criminal justice system. And I'm going to start with you, Busisiwe, if you don't mind. Is the law being used effectively? Is the criminal justice system a deterrent for gender-based violence and femicide?
Thank you very much. I think it's pretty clear, even from your report, that the resources that we currently have are not being used effectively to challenge and to respond to cases of GBV, intimate partner violence, hate crimes against minorities. Additionally, there is a lack of resources. Recently, the CGE called for the opening of about 30-odd courts around sexual violence courts because there is such a lack of processing and there's such backlogs. In the Eastern Cape, for instance, there isn't a forensic testing facility. Everything, including for murders, is sent to the Western Cape, Cape Town to be specific. So you have an entire province whose forensic analyses are dependent on another facility. And so you have a backlog there as well. Other things that were mentioned in your report as I was watching, I'm thinking about even issues around victim advocates within the system. Clearly need to be a concern that we think through and think about. Who informs a victim of her rights? Who informs a victim of when she can make a statement when she's ready? There are other issues that pertain to the nature of the law that, your report identifies as well, is this insistence on consistency. We know, and research does say, that oftentimes the assault in the minds of a victim changes, not because they're being deceitful or not wanting to be truthful, but the nature of how humans recall violent and traumatic incidents shifts through time. And I think that is an important thing that we really need to consider and think through, as your report indicates.
I'm going to come to you, Bafana Khumalo, in just a moment, but I'd like to pose this question first to Lindi Dlamini. Given the work that you do, let's talk about this issue of funding. How do we ensure that funding is being properly channeled? And I want to know if the survivors, the victims, are being consulted in policy design, development and implementation.
Thank you for having me, and good evening to your listeners and viewers as well. I think perhaps it's instructive for me to talk a little bit about how the fund came about. And it really was the culmination of the work of civil society activating for the need to put an end to the scourge. And so the total shutdown movement has been very instrumental in this. The work that was done in the presidential summit led by civil society, which culminated in the drafting of the National Strategic Plan against on gender-based violence. Now, the capacitation of the work that needs to happen and the various streams under the 6 pillars of the National Strategic Plan, it was agreed that it would be important important to capacitate this through funding. And so the reason for the existence of the fund is the knowledge and understanding that we need to build on all the work that has been done by civil society, community-based organizations, NPOs and NGOs doing work in the sector. The fund isn't here to rewrite any of that work, but we stand on the work that has been done, and our role is to provide resources and capacitate the tremendously overburdened organizations that are underfunded so that we can accelerate the path of implementing the various initiatives that will reduce the scourge of this on this country. So the research that has been done is there. I think Bafana will also attest to the work that is done by his organization. We're using that research as well as the research that is happening in the National Strategic Plan pillars that is available from a funding perspective. Our role is to ensure that we raise sufficient resources to amplify the work that has been done so that we can see the end of the scourge sooner rather than later.
So Bafana, just tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in line with what Lindi is saying. I mean, we know that gender-based violence is largely known to be a problem perpetrated by men and community members and individuals who tolerate negative masculine practices. So how do you determine from avoiding making women to be the agents of change when they're not necessarily the problem?
That's a very good question, Tsepiso. I think we have focused a lot on challenging us as men, and boys particularly, on changing the norms that influence this negative behavior that we see in our society. I agree with Commissioner Deyi about the assessment of the legal framework that we have in the country at the moment. But I must take issue with the fact that, Tsepiso, policies don't implement themselves. Policies need leadership and commitment. Our president has been on the forefront talking about this scourge, which is very good and very important. In one of his pronouncements, he makes the assertion, which I agree with, that gender-based violence is the pandemic that is confronting South Africa. But I want to challenge the president and his cabinet. Why is it that we are not spending a similar amount of money like we are doing on COVID, which we have identified as a pandemic, on safety of women and girls in our country? If indeed we are committed to changing the tide against gender-based violence, we obviously need to see an amount of resources that are being put into this intervention. Now, Lindi will know that we are sitting trying to call on private sector to make a contribution, which they should, because this is a problem that is confronting us as a society. But what we need is also to see the public sector, government, coming to the party, making resources available, because we can't change the mindset of men by just talking to men. We need programs that go to schools, that goes to young people who are out of school, that changes the narrative about what it means to be a man. Those things don't just happen by themselves. They require lots of resources.
So let me just stop you there, Bafana, and ask this question. The kind of capacity building that you foresee happening, and as you said, there's been a lot of criticism towards the Department for Women, Children and People with Disabilities, saying it's ineffective. But if we're going to talk about capacity building, what is needed for men and boy children in terms of skills, knowledge, attitude on gender equality, child protection, parenting, on the use of the acquisition of all of these characteristics that should be able to help us prevent?
We need to start with socialization, Tsepiso, because that's where our problem begins. We need to move away from this notion of what kind of toys we buy for our boys and what kind of toys we buy for our girls, because that reinforces this notion of, boys must be go-getters, adventurers. We buy them guns, we buy them things that make them explore what is happening in the world. And girls, we domesticate them. We buy dolls, we buy things that are pink. And for me, that is where the problem starts. So we need programs that starts at home. How do we empower parents so that they provide the kind of skills that will transfer the norms that says to both boys and girls, you are all worthy of dignity and respect, particularly to the boys. We need a lot of work to do so that we have better men tomorrow who understand that you cannot count yourself to be a man simply because you are abusing those that you feel are weaker than you. And that, for me, is the nub of the matter. And that must cut across. Because, unfortunately, this kind of behavior we also see from our leaders, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, who do similar things that send the message that actually women's lives don't mean for much.
All right, Busisiwe, let me come to you.
Get away with it. Yeah.
Let me come to you and talk about the transformative programs that are in place. Do they seriously take into account also the environment that we live in? That we talk about campaigns that are to protect women and the girl child, but the LGBTQI community, there is a lack of nuance in some of those programs. So why is government failing, and why are we as a society failing?
I think this is a very good question. I think that if you look at a lot of the GBV intimate partner violence programs and the theory that underpins it, it comes from, the LGBTI movement. You will note that in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, there was a spike in so-called hate crimes. And what happened was you got a civil society mobilizing around how to address this, right? We have the hate crimes bill that is currently sitting, gathering dust. But what is needed is a concerted effort in how we articulate what violence is, right? I think that a lot of the civil society movements, and this is not in bad faith, but there is a focus in a very heteronormative framework around what intimate partner and GBV violence and the causes of it. And so what happens then when you say that let's keep women safe, we don't really interrogate the heteronormative ideas that inform and perpetuate GBV. And the hope was that with the civil society movement around LGBTI hate crimes, there would be an incorporation of some of that critique and some of that rigorous feminist work. But what you've seen, as we've observed, is that because we are living in a time of crisis and human beings are not very good at thinking through crises, we are resorting to shorthands. We're saying, stop violence against women. It should be what causes men to be violent. And then we can begin, as Mr. Bafana articulates very well, interrogating what is it in our society that allows and fosters this attitude in men that produces this kind of behavior. So we must problematize men, not women. It's not what causes, what is the cause of GBV, but what makes men articulate or perpetuate violence in the ways that they do in our society.
Let's talk about that, Lindi, the various systemic forms of violence and where we are still entrenched in the old thinking, for instance, in terms of patriarchal societies, the cultural and traditional norms. We spoke about transparency earlier on, the need for transparency on the funding for these programs. So how do we get government and societies to take a more holistic approach at dealing with this problem and holding ourselves accountable?
I think, Thabiso, although we're all getting fatigued with the problem statement articulation, I think the voices cannot calm down. The crescendo of voices must continue. And Mr. Khumalo puts it well when he says, I put the challenge to the president and the cabinet, because the reason why, for instance, the GBVF Response Fund 1 fund exists is to start to be a catalyst in dealing with these problems and funding these programs. But this is a multi-sectoral issue. It's a multifaceted problem. And to have the reach that we need to have requires a great amount of funding that cannot exclude the government. If we are to, for instance, attack gender role stereotyping, which is the genesis in socialization within the home and within the educational environment, and start to deal with those things, how we stream children into different subjects and so forth, how we start to other people in society, those are all massive programs that require themselves to be a daily part of conversation.
I know this is going to be a challenge, but because we have run out of time, I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds to please tell us, why do you think as a society we're getting fatigued with talking about gender-based violence, and what we can do as South Africans to improve the narrative? Lindi, your 30 seconds.
It causes us to look at ourselves and how we act and how we contribute to the problem, either by being heteronormative in our approach and othering people who are other than what we look like, what we sound like, and how we think.
Bafana, your 30 seconds?
I think we're getting fatigued, Sepiso, because we hear a lot of rhetoric, but very little action. I think we are eager as South Africans to see implementation. As Lindi has indicated, we have a national strategic plan. The key now is to implement so that we can see tangible change.
Busisiwe, your 30 seconds?
I think that we need braver leadership. I think that we can do a lot as citizens in our individual capacity, but as Lindi has articulated, we need systems change. And across all sectors of our society, we need changes in education. We need changes in social security and social security provision. We need changes in the SAPS and policing of our streets. We need changes in having lighting infrastructure in our streets. So it is an intersectional problem, and I think that we need braver leadership, and we need to ask our leaders to be accountable for their positions.
Thank you to all of you for your time and sharing with us your insights. Really, really appreciate it. In conversation there with Bafana Khumalo of the Sonke Gender Justice, he's a co-executive director there, Lindi Dlamini, the CEO of GBVF Response Fund, as well as Busisiwe Deyi, who's a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality.